Book 6, Chapter 2 of The Mill on the Floss. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Serafina Saransky. The Mill on the Floss by George Eliot. Book 6, The Great Temptation, Chapter 2, First Impressions. "He is very clever, Maggie," said Lucy. She was kneeling on a footstool at Maggie's feet, after placing that dark lady in the large crimson velvet chair. "I feel sure you will like him. Oh, I hope you will." "I shall be very difficult to please," said Maggie, smiling, and holding up one of Lucy's long curls that the sunlight might shine through it. "A gentleman who thinks he is good enough for Lucy must expect to be sharply criticized." "Indeed, he's a great deal too good for me, and sometimes, when he's away, I almost think it can't really be that he loves me. But I can never doubt it when he is with me, though I couldn't bear any one but you to know that I feel in that way, Maggie." "Oh, then, if I disapprove of him, you can give him up, since you're not engaged," said Maggie, with playful gravity. "I would rather not be engaged. When people are engaged, they begin to think of being married soon," said Lucy, too thoroughly preoccupied to notice Maggie's joke. "And I should like everything to go on for a long while just as it is. Sometimes I am quite frightened lest Stephen should say that he has spoken to Papa, and from something that fell from Papa the other day, I feel sure he and Mr. Guest are expecting that. And Stephen's sisters are very civil to me now. At first I think they didn't like his paying me attention, and that was natural. It does seem out of keeping that I should ever live in a great place like the Park House, such a little insignificant thing as I am." "But people are not expected to be large in proportion to the houses they live in, like snails," said Maggie, laughing. "Pray, are Mr. Guest's sisters giantesses?" "Oh, no, and not handsome. I mean, that is, not very," said Lucy, half penitent at this uncharitable remark. "But he is, well, at least he is generally considered very handsome." "Though you are unable to share that opinion?" "Oh, I don't know," said Lucy, blushing pink over brow and neck. "It is a bad plan to raise expectation. You will perhaps be disappointed. But I have prepared a charming surprise for him. I shall have a glorious laugh against him. I shall not tell you what it is, though." Lucy rose from her knees and went to a little distance, holding her pretty head on one side, as if she had been arranging Maggie for a portrait and wished to judge of the general effect. "Stand up a moment, Maggie." "What is your pleasure now?" said Maggie, smiling languidly as she rose from her chair and looked down on her slight, aerial cousin, whose figure was quite subordinate to her faultless drapery of silk and crape. Lucy kept her contemplative attitude a moment or two in silence, and then said, "I can't think what witchery it is in you, Maggie, that makes you look best in shabby clothes, though you really must have a new dress now. But do you know, last night I was trying to fancy you in a handsome, fashionable dress, and do what I would, that old limp merino would come back as the only right thing for you. I wonder if Marie Antoinette looked all the grander when her gown was darned at the elbows. Now, if I were to put on anything shabby, I would be quite unnoticeable. I should be a mere rag." "Oh, quite," said Maggie, with mock gravity. "You would be liable to be swept out of the room with the cobwebs and carpet dust, and to find yourself under the grate, like Cinderella. Mayn't I sit down now?" "Yes, now you may," said Lucy, laughing. Then, with an air of serious reflection, unfastening her large jet brooch, "But you must change brooches, Maggie. That little butterfly looks silly on you." "But won't that mar the charming effect of my constant shabbiness?" said Maggie, seating herself submissively, while Lucy knelt again and unfastened the contemptible butterfly. "I wish my mother were of your opinion, for she was fretting last night because this is my best frock. I've been saving my money to pay for some lessons. I shall never get a better situation without more accomplishments." Maggie gave a little sigh. "Now don't put on that sad look again," said Lucy, pinning the large brooch below Maggie's fine throat. "You're forgetting that you've left that dreary schoolroom behind you, and have no little girl's clothes to mend." "Yes," said Maggie, "it is with me as I used to think it would be with the poor uneasy white bear I saw at the show. I thought he must have got so stupid with the habit of turning backward and forward in that narrow space that he would keep doing it if they set him free. One gets a bad habit of being unhappy." "But I shall put you under a discipline of pleasure that will make you lose that bad habit," said Lucy, sticking the black butterfly absently in her own collar, while her eyes met Maggie's affectionately. "Oh, you dear tiny thing," said Maggie, in one of her bursts of loving admiration. "You enjoy other people's happiness so much. I believe you would do without any of your own. Oh, I wish I were like you." "I've never been tried in that way," said Lucy. "I've always been so happy. I don't know whether I could bear much trouble. I never had any but poor mamma's death. You have been tried, Maggie, and I'm sure you feel for other people quite as much as I do." "No, Lucy," said Maggie, shaking her head slowly. "I don't enjoy their happiness as you do, else I should feel more contented. I do feel for them when they are in trouble. I don't think I could ever bear to make any one unhappy. And yet I often hate myself, because I get angry sometimes at the sight of happy people. I think I get worse as I get older, more selfish. Oh, that seems dreadful." "Now, Maggie," said Lucy, in a tone of remonstrance, "I don't believe a word of that. It is all a gloomy fancy, just because you are depressed by dull, wearisome life." "Well, perhaps it is," said Maggie, resolutely clearing away the clouds from her face with a bright smile, and throwing herself backward in her chair. "Perhaps it comes from the school diet, watery rice pudding spiced with pinnock. Let us hope it will give way before my mother's custard, and this charming Geoffrey crayon." Maggie took up the sketch-book, which lay by her on the table. "Do I look fit to be seen with this little brooch?" said Lucy, going to survey the effect in the chimney-glass. "Oh, no! Mr Guest will be obliged to go out of the room again if he sees you in it. Pray make haste and put another on." Lucy hurried out of the room, but Maggie did not take the opportunity of opening her book. She let it fall on her knees, while her eyes wandered to the window, where she could see the sunshine falling on the rich clumps of spring flowers and on the long hedge of laurels, and beyond, the silvery breadth of the dear old Floss, that at this distance seemed to be sleeping in a morning holiday. The sweet fresh garden scent came through the open window, and the birds were busy flitting and lighting, gurgling and singing. Yet Maggie's eyes began to fill with tears. The sight of the old scenes had made the rush of memory so painful that even yesterday she had only been able to rejoice in her mother's restored comfort and Tom's brotherly friendliness, as we rejoice in good news of friends at a distance, rather than in the presence of a happiness which we share. Memory and imagination urged upon her a sense of privation too keen to let her taste what was offered in the transient present. Her future, she thought, was likely to be worse than her past, for after her years of contented renunciation, she had slipped back into desire and longing. She found joyless days of distasteful occupation harder and harder. She found the image of the intense and varied life she yearned for, and despaired of, becoming more and more importunate. The sound of the opening door roused her, and hastily wiping away her tears, she began to turn over the leaves of her book. "There is one pleasure I know, Maggie, that your deepest dismalness will never resist," said Lucy, beginning to speak as soon as she entered the room. "That is music, and I mean you to have quite a riotous feast of it. I mean you to get up your playing again, which used to be so much better than mine when we were at Laceham." "Oh, you would have laughed to see me playing the little girl tunes over and over to them when I took them to practice," said Maggie, "just for the sake of fingering the dear keys again. But I don't know whether I could play anything more difficult now than 'Begone, dull care.'" "I know what a wild state of joy you used to be in when the glee men came round," said Lucy, taking up her embroidery. and we might have all those old glees that you used to love so, if I were certain that you don't feel exactly as Tom does about some things." "I should have thought there was nothing you might be more certain of," said Maggie, smiling. "Well, I ought rather to have said one particular thing, because if you feel just as he does about that, we shall want our third voice. St. Oggs is so miserably provided with musical gentlemen. There are really only Stephen and Philip Wakem who have any knowledge of music, so as to be able to sing a part." Lucy had looked up from her work as she uttered the last sentence, and saw that there was a change in Maggie's face. "Does it hurt you to hear the name mentioned, Maggie? If it does, I will not speak of him again. I know Tom will not see him if he can avoid it." "I don't feel at all as Tom does on that subject," said Maggie, rising and going to the window as if she wanted to see more of the landscape. "I've always liked Philip Wakem, ever since I was a little girl and saw him at Lorton. He was so good when Tom hurt his foot." "Oh, I'm so glad," said Lucy. "Then you won't mind his coming sometimes, and we can have much more music than we could without him. I'm very fond of poor Philip. Only I wish he were not so morbid about his deformity. I suppose it is his deformity that makes him so sad, and sometimes bitter. It is certainly very piteous to see his poor little crooked body and pale face among great, strong people." But Lucy," said Maggie, trying to arrest the prattling stream. "There's the doorbell. That must be Stephen," Lucy went on, not noticing Maggie's faint effort to speak. "One of the things I most admire in Stephen is that he makes a greater friend of Philip than anyone." It was too late for Maggie to speak now. The drawing-room door was opening, and Minnie was already growling in a small way at the entrance of a tall gentleman, who went up to Lucy and took her hand with a half-polite, half-tender glance and tone of inquiry, which seemed to indicate that he was unconscious of any other presence. "Let me introduce you to my cousin, Miss Tulliver," said Lucy, turning with wicked enjoyment toward Maggie, who now approached from the farther window. "This is Mr. Stephen Guest." For one instant Stephen could not conceal his astonishment at the sight of this tall, dark-eyed nymph with her jet-black coronet of hair. The next Maggie felt herself, for the first time in her life, receiving the tribute of a very deep blush and a very deep bow from a person toward whom she herself was conscious of timidity. This new experience was very agreeable to her, so agreeable that it almost effaced her previous emotion about Philip. There was a new brightness in her eyes and a very becoming flush on her cheek as she seated herself. "I hope you perceive what a striking likeness you drew the day before yesterday," said Lucy, with a pretty laugh of triumph. She enjoyed her lover's confusion. The advantage was usually on his side. "This designing cousin of yours quite deceived me, Miss Tulliver," said Stephen, seating himself by Lucy and stooping to play with Minnie, only looking at Maggie furtively. "She said you had light hair and blue eyes." "Nay, it was you who said so," remonstrated Lucy. "I only refrained from destroying your confidence in your own second sight." "I wish I could always err in the same way," said Stephen, "and find reality so much more beautiful than my preconceptions." "Now you have proved yourself equal to the occasion," said Maggie, "and said what it was incumbent on you to say under the circumstances." She flashed a slightly deviant look at him. It was clear to her that he had been drawing a satirical portrait of her beforehand. Lucy had said he was inclined to be satirical, and Maggie had mentally supplied the addition, "and rather conceited." "An alarming amount of devil there," was Stephen's first thought. The second, when she had bent over her work, was, "I wish you would look at me again." The next was to answer, "I suppose all phrases of mere compliment have their turn to be true. A man is occasionally grateful when he says thank you. It's rather hard upon him that he must use the same words with which all the world declines a disagreeable invitation. Don't you think so, Miss Tulliver?" "No," said Maggie, looking at him with her direct glance. "If we use common words on a great occasion, they are the more striking, because they are felt at once to have a particular meaning, like old banners or everyday clothes hung up in a sacred place.
"Then my compliment ought to be eloquent," said Stephen,
really not quite knowing what he said while Maggie looked at him, seeing that the words were so far beneath the occasion. "No compliment can be eloquent except as an expression of indifference," said Maggie, flushing a little. Lucy was rather alarmed. She thought Stephen and Maggie were not going to like each other. She had always feared lest Maggie should appear too old and clever to please the critical gentleman. "Why, dear Maggie," she interposed, "you have always pretended that you are too fond of being admired, and now, I think, you are angry because someone ventures to admire you." "Not at all," said Maggie. "I like too well to feel that I am admired, but compliments never make me feel that."
"I will never pay you a compliment again, Miss Tulliver," said Stephen.
"Thank you, that will be a proof of respect." Poor Maggie! She was so unused to society that she could take nothing as a matter of course, and never in her life had she spoken from the lips merely, so that she must necessarily appear absurd to more experienced ladies, from the excessive feeling she was apt to throw into very trivial incidents. But she was even conscious herself of a little absurdity in this instance.
It was true that she had a theoretic objection to compliments, and had once said impatiently to Philip that she didn't see why women were to be told with a simper that they were beautiful, any more than old men were to be told that they were venerable.
Still, to be so irritated by a common practice in the case of a stranger like Mr. Guest, and to care about his having spoken slightingly
Of her,
before he had seen her, was certainly unreasonable, and as soon as she was silent, she began to be ashamed of herself. It did not occur to her that her irritation was due to the pleasanter emotion which preceded it, just as when we are satisfied with a sense of glowing warmth, an innocent drop of water may fall upon us as a sudden smart. Stephen was too well bred not to seem unaware that the previous conversation could have been felt embarrassing, and at once began to talk of impersonal matters, asking Lucy if she knew when the bazaar was at length to take place, so that there might be some hope of seeing her rain the influence of her eyes on objects more grateful than those worsted flowers that were growing under her fingers. "Some day next month, I believe," said Lucy. "But your sisters are doing more than I am. They have the largest stall."
"Ah, yes, but they carry on their manufactures in their own sitting-room, where I don't intrude on them. I see you are not addicted to the fashionable vice of fancy work, Miss Tulliver,"
said Stephen, looking at Maggie's plain hemming.
"No," said Maggie. "I can do nothing more difficult or more elegant than shirt-making."
"And your plain sewing is so beautiful, Maggie," said Lucy, "that I think I shall beg a few specimens of you to show as fancy work. Your exquisite sewing is quite a mystery to me. You used to dislike that sort of work so much in old days." "It is a mystery easily explained, dear," said Maggie, looking up quietly. "Plain sewing was the only thing I could get money by, so I was obliged to try and do it well." Lucy, good and simple as she was, could not help blushing a little. She did not quite like that Stephen should know that. Maggie need not have mentioned it. Perhaps there was some pride in the confession, the pride of poverty that will not be ashamed of itself. But if Maggie had been the queen of coquettes, she could hardly have invented a means of giving greater piquancy to her beauty in Stephen's eyes. I am not sure that the quiet admission of plain sewing and poverty would have done alone, but assisted by the beauty, they made Maggie more unlike other women even than she had seemed first. "But I can knit, Lucy," Maggie went on, "if that will be of any use for your bazaar." "Oh, yes, of infinite use. I shall set you to work with scarlet wool to-morrow. But your sister is the most enviable person," continued Lucy, turning to Stephen, "to have the talent of modelling. She is doing a wonderful bust of Dr. Kent entirely from memory."
"Why, if she can remember to put the eyes very near together, and the corners of the mouth very far apart, the likeness can hardly fail to be striking in St. Oggs."
"Now that is very wicked of you," said Lucy, looking rather hurt. "I didn't think you would speak disrespectfully of Dr. Ken." I say anything disrespectful of Dr. Ken? Heaven forbid! But I am not about to respect a libellous bust of him. I think Ken one of the most finest fellows in the world. I don't care much about the tall candlesticks he has put on the communion table, and I shouldn't like to spoil my temper by getting up to early prayers every morning. But he's the only man I ever knew personally who seems to me to have anything of the real apostle in him. A man who has 800 a year and is contented with deal furniture and boiled beef because he gives 2/3 of his income. That was a very fine thing of him, taking into his house that poor lad Grattan, who shot his mother by accident. He sacrifices more time than a less busy man could spare to save the poor fellow from getting into a morbid state of mind about it. He takes the lad out with him constantly, I see." "That is beautiful," said Maggie, who had let her work fall and was listening with keen interest. "I never knew any one who did such things." "And one admires that sort of action in Ken all the more," said Stephen, "because his manners in general are rather cold and severe. There's nothing sugary and maudlin about him." "Oh, I think he's a perfect character," said Lucy, with pretty enthusiasm. "No, there I can't agree with you," said Stephen, shaking his head with sarcastic gravity. "Now, what fault can you point out in him?" "He's Anglican." "Well, those are the right views, I think," said Lucy gravely. "That settles the question in the abstract," said Stephen, "but not from parliamentary point of view. He has set the dissenters and the church people by the ears, and a rising senator like myself, of whose services the country is very much in need, will find it inconvenient when he puts up for the honour of representing St Oggs in a parliament." "Do you really think of that?" said Lucy, her eyes brightening with a proud pleasure that made her neglect the argumentative interests of Anglicanism. "Decidedly, whether old Mr. Leyburn's public spirit and gout induce him to give way. My father's heart is set on it, and gifts like mine, you know—" Here Stephen drew himself up and rubbed his large white hands over his hair with playful self-admiration. "Well, gifts like mine involve great responsibilities. Don't you think so, Miss Tulliver?" "Yes," said Maggie, smiling, but not looking up. "So much fluency and self-possession should not be wasted entirely on private occasions." "Ah, I see how much penetration you have," said Stephen. "You have discovered already that I am talkative and impudent. Now superficial people never discern that, owing to my manner, I suppose." "She doesn't look at me when I talk of myself," he thought, while his listeners were laughing. "I must try other subjects." "Did Lucy intend to be present at the meeting of the book club next week?" was the next question. Then followed the recommendation to choose Southey's Life of Cowper, unless she were inclined to be philosophical, and startle the ladies of St Oggs by voting for one of the Bridgewater treatises. Of course Lucy wished to know what these alarming learned books were, and as it is always pleasant to improve the minds of ladies by talking to them at ease on subjects of which they know nothing, Stephen became quite brilliant in an account of Buckland's treatise, which he had just been reading. He was rewarded by seeing Maggie let her work fall, and gradually get so absorbed in his wonderful geological story that she sat looking at him, leaning forward with crossed arms and with an entire absence of self-consciousness, as if he had been the snuffiest old professor and she a downy-limbed alumna. He was so fascinated by the clear, large gaze that at last he forgot to look away from it occasionally toward Lucy. But she, sweet child, was only rejoicing that Stephen was proving to Maggie how clever he was, and that they would certainly be good friends after all. "I will bring you the book, shall I, Miss Tulliver?" said Stephen, when he found the stream of his recollections running rather shallow. "There are many illustrations in it that you may like to see." "Oh, thank you," said Maggie, blushing with returning self-consciousness at this direct address, and taking up her work again. "No, no," Lucy interposed. "I must forbid your plunging Maggie in books. I shall never get her away from them, and I want her to have delicious do-nothing days, filled with boating and chatting and riding and driving. That is the holiday she needs." "Apropos," said Stephen, looking at his watch, Shall we go out for a row on the river now? The tide will suit for us to the Tofton way, and we can walk back." That was a delightful proposition to Maggie, for it was years since she had been on the river. When she was gone to put on her bonnet, Lucy lingered to give an order to the servant, and took the opportunity of telling Stephen that Maggie had no objection to seeing Philip, so that it was a pity that she had sent that note for the day before yesterday. But she would write another tomorrow and invite him. "I'll call and beat him up tomorrow," said Stephen, "and bring him with me in the evening, shall I? My sisters will want to call on you when I tell them your cousin is with you. I must leave the field clear for them in the morning." "Oh, yes, pray bring him," said Lucy. "And you will like Maggie, shan't you?" she added, in a beseeching tone. "Isn't she a dear, noble-looking creature?" "Too tall," said Stephen, smiling down upon her, "and a little too fiery. She's not my type of woman, you know." Gentlemen, you are aware, are apt to impart these imprudent confidences to ladies concerning their unfavourable opinion of sister fair ones. That is why so many women have the advantage of knowing that they are secretly repulsive to men who have self-denyingly made ardent love to them. And hardly anything could be more distinctly characteristic of Lucy than that she both implicitly believed what Stephen said, and was determined that Maggie should not know it. But you, who have a higher logic than the verbal to guide you, have already foreseen, as the direct sequence to that unfavourable opinion of Stephen's, that he walked down to the boat-house calculating, by the aid of a vivid imagination, that Maggie must give him her hand at least twice in consequence of this pleasant boating plan, and that a gentleman who wishes ladies to look at him is advantageously situated when he is rowing them in a boat. What then? Had he fallen in love with the surprising daughter of Mrs. Tulliver at first sight? Certainly not. Such passions are never heard of in real life. Besides, he was in love already, and half engaged to the dearest little creature in the world, and he was not a man to make a fool of himself in any way. But when one is 25, one has not chalkstones at one's finger ends, that the touch of a handsome girl should be entirely indifferent. It was perfectly natural and safe to admire beauty and enjoy looking at it, at least under such circumstances as the present. And there was really something very interesting about this girl, with her poverty and troubles. It was gratifying to see the friendship between the two cousins. Generally, Stephen admitted, he was not fond of women who had any peculiarity of character, but here the peculiarity seemed really of a superior kind, and provided one is not obliged to marry such women, why they certainly make a variety in social intercourse. Maggie did not fulfil Stephen's hope by looking at him during the first quarter of an hour. Her eyes were too full of the old banks that she knew so well. She felt lonely, cut off from Philip, the only person who had ever seemed to love her devotedly as she had always longed to be loved. But presently the rhythmic movement of the oars attracted her, and she thought she would like to learn how to row. This roused her from her reverie, and she asked if she may take an oar. It appeared that she required much teaching, and she became ambitious. The exercise brought the warm blood into her cheeks, and made her inclined to take her lesson merrily. "I shall not be satisfied until I can manage both oars and row you and Lucy," she said, looking very bright as she stepped out of the boat. Maggie, we know, was apt to forget the thing she was doing, and she had chosen an inopportune moment for her remark. Her foot slipped, but happily Mr. Stephen Guest held her hand, and kept her up with a firm grasp. "You have not hurt yourself at all, I hope?" he said, bending to look in her face with anxiety. It was very charming to be taken care of in that kind, graceful manner by someone taller and stronger than oneself. Maggie had never felt just in the same way before. When they reached home again, they found Uncle and Aunt Pullet seated with Mrs. Tulliver in the drawing-room, and Stephen hurried away, asking leave to come again in the evening. "And pray bring with you the volume of Purcell that you took away," said Lucy. "I want Maggie to hear your best songs." Aunt Pullet, under the certainty that Maggie would be invited to go out with Lucy, probably to Park House, was much shocked at the shabbiness of her clothes, which, when witnessed by the higher society of St. Oggs, would be a discredit to the family. That demanded a strong and prompt remedy,
and the consultation as to what would be most suitable to this end, from among the superfluities of Mrs. Pullet's wardrobe, was one that Lucy, as well as Mrs. Tulliver, entered into with some zeal. Maggie must really have an evening dress as soon as possible, and she was about the same height as Aunt Pullet. "But she is so much broader across the shoulders than I am. It is very ill-convenient," said Mrs. Pullet. "Else she might wear that beautiful black brocade of mine without any alteration. And her arms are beyond everything," added Mrs. Pullet, sorrowfully, as she lifted Maggie's large round arm. "Oh, she'd never get my sleeves on." "Oh, never mind that, aunt. Send us the dress," said Lucy. "I don't mean Maggie to have long sleeves, and I have an abundance of black lace for trimming. Her arms will look beautiful." "Well, Maggie's arms are a pretty shape," said Mrs. Tulliver. "They're like mine used to be, only mine was never brown. Oh, I wish she had our family skin." "Nonsense, auntie," said Lucy, patting her Aunt Tulliver's shoulder. "You don't understand those things. A painter would think Maggie's complexion beautiful." "Maybe, my dear," said Mrs. Tulliver submissively. "You know better than I do. Only when I was young, a brown skin wasn't thought well on among respectable folk." "No," said Uncle Pullet, who took intense interest in the ladies' conversation as he sucked his lozenges. "Though there was a song about the nut-brown maid, too. I think she was Crazy Kate, but I can't justly remember." "Oh, dear, dear," said Maggie, laughing but impatient. "I think that will be the end of my brown skin, if it is always to be talked about so much." End of Book 6, Chapter 2. Recording by Sarafina Saransky in Utrecht, Holland.
Chapter 3 of The Mill on the Floss. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ted Nugent. The Mill on the Floss by George Eliot. Book 6. The Great Temptation. Chapter 3. Confidential Moment. When Maggie went up to her bedroom that night, it appeared that she was not at all inclined to undress. She set down her candle on the first table that presented itself, and began to walk up and down her room, which was a large one, with a firm, regular, and rather rapid step, which showed that the exercise was the instinctive vent of strong excitement. Her eyes and cheeks had an almost feverish brilliancy. Her head was thrown backward, and her hands were clasped, with the palms outward, and with that tension of the arms which is apt to accompany mental absorption. Had anything remarkable happened? Nothing that you are not likely to consider in the highest degree unimportant. She has been hearing some fine music, sung by a fine bass voice, but then it was sung in a provincial, amateur fashion, such as would have left a critical ear much to desire, and she was conscious of having been looked at a great deal, in rather a furtive manner, from beneath a pair of well-marked horizontal eyebrows, with a glance that seemed somehow to have caught the vibratory influence of the voice. Such things could have had no perceptible effect on a thoroughly well-educated young lady, with a perfectly balanced mind, who had had all the advantages of fortune, training, and refined society. But if Maggie had been that young lady, you would probably have known nothing about her. Her life would have had so few vicissitudes that it would hardly have been written, for the happiest women, like the happiest nations, have no history. In poor Maggie's highly strung, hungry nature, just come away from a third-rate schoolroom, with all its jarring sounds and pretty round of tasks. These apparently trivial courses had the effect of rousing and exalting her imagination in a way that was mysterious to herself. It was not that she thought distinctly of Mr. Stephen Guest, or went on the indications that he looked at her with admiration. It was rather that she felt the half-remote presence of a world of love and beauty and delight, made up of vague, mingled images from all the poetry and romance she has ever read, or had ever woven in her dreamy reveries. Her mind glanced back once or twice to the time when she had courted privation, when she had thought all longing, all impatience was subdued. But that condition seemed irrecoverably gone, and she recoiled from the remembrance of it. No prayer, no striving now, could bring back that negative peace. The battle of her life, it seemed, was not to be decided in that short and easy way, by perfect renunciation at the very threshold of her youth. The music was still vibrating in her still, person's music, with its wild passion and fancy, and she could not stay in the recollection of that bare, lonely past. She was in her brighter aerial world again, when a little tap came at the door. Of course, it was her cousin, who entered in ample white dressing gown. "Why, Maggie, you naughty child, haven't you begun to undress?" said Lucy in astonishment. "I promised not to come to talk to you, because I thought you must be tired. But here you are, looking as if you were ready to dress for a ball. Come, come, get on your dressing gown and unplait your hair." "Well, you're not very forward," retorted Maggie, hastily reaching her own pink cotton gown, and looking at Lucy's light brown hair brushed back in curly disorder. "Oh, I have not much to do. I shall sit down and talk to you till I see you are really on the way to bed." While Maggie stood and unplaited her long black hair over her pink drapery, Lucy sat down near the toilet table, watching her with affectionate eyes, and hid a little aside, like a pretty spaniel. "If it appears to you at all incredible that young lady should be led on to talk confidentially in a situation of this kind, I will beg you to remember that human life furnishes many exceptional cases." "You really have enjoyed the music tonight, haven't you, Maggie?" "Oh, yes, that is what prevented me from feeling sleepy. I think I should have no other mortal wants if I could always have plenty of music. It seems to infuse strength into my limbs and ideas into my brain. Life seems to go on without effort when I am filled with music. At other times, one is conscious of carrying a weight. And Stephen had a splendid voice, hasn't he?" "Well, perhaps we are neither of us judges of that," said Maggie, laughing, as she seated herself and tossed her long hair back. "You are not impartial, and I think any barrel organ splendid. But tell me what you think of him, now. Tell me exactly, good and bad too." "Oh, I think you should humiliate him a little. A lover should not be so much at ease, and so self-confident. He ought to tremble more." "Nonsense, Maggie! As if anyone should tremble at me. You think he is conceited, I see that. But you don't dislike him, do you?" "Dislike him? No. Am I in the habit of seeing such charming people that I should be very difficult to please? Besides, how could I dislike anyone that promise to make you happy, my dear thing?" Maggie pinched Lucy's dimpled chin. "We shall have more music tomorrow evening," said Lucy, looking happy already, "for Stephen will bring Philip Wakem with him." "Oh, Lucy, I can't see him," said Maggie, turning pale. "At least, I could not see him without Tom's leave." "Is Tom such a tyrant as that?" said Lucy, surprised. "I'll take the responsibility then. Tell him that it was my fault." "But, dear," said Maggie falteringly, "I promised Tom very solemnly before my father's death. I promised him I would not speak to Philip without his knowledge and consent. And I have a great dread of opening the subject with Tom, of getting into a quarrel with him again." "But I never heard of anything so strange and unreasonable. What harm can poor Philip have done? May I speak to Tom about it?" "Oh, no, pray don't, dear," said Maggie. "I'll go to him myself tomorrow, and tell him that you wished Philip to come. I've thought before of asking him to absolve me from my promise, but I've not had the courage to determine on it." They were both silent for some moments, and then Lucy said, "Maggie, you have secret from me, and I have none from you." Maggie looked meditatively away from Lucy. Then she turned to her and said, "I should like to tell you about Philip, but Lucy, you must not betray that you know it to anyone, least of all to Philip himself or to Mr. Stephen Guest." The narrative lasted long, for Maggie had never before known the relief of such an outpouring. She had never before told Lucy anything of her inmost life, and the sweet face bent towards her with sympathetic interest, and the little hand pressing hers encouraged her to speak on. On 2 points only she was not expansive. She did not betray fully what still rankled in her mind as Tom's great offence, the insults he had heaped on Philip. Angry as the remembrance still made her, she could not bear that anyone else should know it at all, both for Tom's sake and Philip's. And she could not bear to tell Lucy of the last scene between her father and Wakem, though it was this scene which she had ever seen felt to be a new barrier between herself and Philip. She merely said she saw now that Tom was, on the whole, right in regarding any prospect of love and marriage between her and Philip as put out of the question by the relation of the two families. Of course, Philip's father would never consent. "There, Lucy, you have had my story," said Maggie, smiling, with the tears in her eyes. "You see, I'm like Sir Andrew Aguecheek. I was adored once." "Ah, now I see how it is you know Shakespeare and everything, and have learned so much since you left school, which was always seemed to me witchcraft before. Part of your general uncanniness," said Lucy. She mewed a little with her eyes downward, and then added, looking at Maggie, "It is very beautiful that you should love Philip. I never thought such a happiness would befall him, and in my opinion you ought not to give him up. There are obstacles now, but they may be done away with in time." Maggie shook her head. "Yes," persisted Lucy, "I can't help being hopeful about it. There is something romantic in it, out of the common way, just what everything that happens to you ought to be, and Philip will adore you like a husband in a fairy tale. Oh, I shall puzzle my small brain to contrive some plot that will bring everybody into the right mind, so that you can marry Philip when I marry somebody else. Wouldn't that be a pretty ending to all my poor Maggie's troubles?" Maggie tried to smile, but shivered, as if she felt a certain chill. "Oh dear, you are cold," said Lucy. "You must go to bed, and so must I. I dare not think what time is it." They kissed each other, and Lucy went away, possessed of a confidence which had a strong influence over her subsequent impressions. Maggie had been thoroughly sincere. Her nature had never found it easy to be otherwise. But confidences are sometimes blighting, even when they are sincere. End of Book 6, Chapter 3.
Chapter 4 of The Mill on the Floss. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Amanda Hindman. The Mill on the Floss by George Eliot. Book 6, The Great Temptation. Chapter 4, Brother and Sister. Maggie was obliged to go to Tom's lodgings in the middle of the day, when he would be coming in to dinner, else she would not have found him at home. He was not lodging with entire strangers. Our friend Bob Jakin had, with Mumps's tacit consent, taken not only a wife about 8 months ago, but also one of those queer old houses, pierced with surprising passages, by the waterside, where, as he observed, his wife and mother could keep themselves out of mischief by letting out 2 pleasure boats, in which he had invested some of his savings, and by taking in a lodger for the parlour and spare bedroom. Under these circumstances, what could be better for the interest of all parties, sanitary considerations apart, than that the lodger should be Mr. Tom? It was Bob's wife who opened the door to Maggie. She was a tiny woman, with the general physiognomy of a Dutch doll, looking, in comparison with Bob's mother, who filled up the passage in the rear, very much like one of those human figures which the artist finds conveniently standing near a colossal statue to show the proportions. The tiny woman curtsied, and looked up at Maggie with some awe as soon as she had opened the door. But the words, "Is my brother at home?" which Maggie uttered smilingly, made her turn round with sudden excitement and say, mother, tell Bob, it's Miss Maggie. Come in, miss, for goodness do," she went on, opening a side door, and endeavouring to flatten her person against the wall to make the utmost space for the visitor. Sad recollections crowded on Maggie as she entered the small parlour, which was now all that poor Tom had to call by the name of home, that name which had once, so many years ago, meant for both of them the same sum of dear familiar objects. But everything was not strange to her in this new room. The first thing her eyes dwelt on was the large old Bible, and the sight was not likely to disperse the old memories. She stood without speaking. "If you please to take the privilege of sitting down, miss," said Mrs. Jakin, rubbing her apron over a perfectly clean chair, and then lifting up the corner of that garment, and holding it to her face with an air of embarrassment, as she looked wonderingly at Maggie. "Bob is at home, then?" said Maggie, recovering herself, and smiling at the bashful Dutch doll. "Yes, miss, but I think he must be washing and dressing himself. I'll go and see," said Mrs. Jakin, disappearing. But she presently came back, walking with new courage, a little way behind her husband, who showed the brilliancy of his blue eyes and regular white teeth in the doorway, bowing respectfully. "How do you do, Bob?" said Maggie, coming forward and putting out her hand to him. "I always meant to pay your wife a visit, and I shall come another day on purpose for that, if she will let me. But I was obliged to come to-day to speak to my brother." "He'll be in before long, miss. He's doing finely, Mr. Tom is. He'll be one of the first men hereabouts, you'll see that." "Well, Bob, I'm sure he'll be indebted to you, whatever he becomes. He said so himself only the other night, when he was talking of you." Miss, that's his way o' taking it. But I think the more on't when he says a thing, because his tongue doesn't overshoot him as mine does. Lors, I'm no better nor a tilted bottle, I aren't. I can't stop my sin when once I begin. But you look rarely, miss. It does me good to see you. What do you say now, Prissy?" Here Bob turned to his wife. "Isn't it all come true as I said? Though there isn't many sorts o' goods I can't overpraise when I set my tongue to it." Mrs. Bob's small nose seemed to be following the example of her eyes in turning up reverentially toward Maggie, but she was able now to smile and curtsy, and say, "I'd looked for'ard like anything to seeing you, miss, for my husband's tongue's been running on you like as if he was light-headed ever since first he come a-courting on me." "Well, well," said Bob, looking rather silly, "go and see after the taters, else Mr. Tom'll have to wait for 'em." "I hope Mumps is friendly with Mrs. Jakin, Bob," said Maggie, smiling. "I remember you used to say he wouldn't like your marrying." "Eh, miss," said Bob, "he made up his mind to it when he'd seed what a little un she was. He pretends not to see her mostly, or else to think as she isn't full growed. But about Mr. Tom, miss," said Bob, speaking lower and looking serious, "he's as close as a iron biler, he is, but I'm a cutish chap, and when I've left off carrying my pack, and I'm at a loose end, I've got more brains nor I know what to do with, and I'm forced to busy myself wi' other folks's insides. And it worrets me as Mr. Tom will sit by himself so glumpish, a-knitting his brow, and a-looking at the fire of a night. He should be a bit livelier now, a fine young fellow like him. My wife says when she goes in sometimes, and he takes no notice of her, he sits looking into the fire and frowning as if he was watching folks at work in it. He thinks so much about business," said Maggie. "Ay," said Bob, speaking lower, "but do you think it's nothing else, miss? He's close, Mr. Tom is, but I'm a cute chap, I am, and I thought towart last Christmas as I'd found out a soft place in him. It was about a little black spaniel, a rare bit o' breed, as he made a fuss to get. But since then summat's come over him, as he's set his teeth again things more nor iver, for all he's had such good luck. And I wanted to tell you, miss, 'cause I thought you might work it out of him a bit now you're come. He's a deal too lonely, and doesn't go into company enough." "I'm afraid I have very little power over him, Bob," said Maggie, a good deal moved by Bob's suggestion. It was a totally new idea to her mind that Tom could have his love troubles. Poor fellow, and in love with Lucy too. But it was perhaps a mere fancy of Bob's too officious brain. The present of the dog meant nothing more than cousinship and gratitude. But Bob had already said, "Here's Mr. Tom," and the outer door was opening. "There is no time to spare, Tom," said Maggie, as soon as Bob left the room. "I must tell you at once what I came about, else I shall be hindering you from taking your dinner." Tom stood with his back against the chimney-piece, and Maggie was seated opposite the light. He noticed that she was tremulous, and he had a presentiment of the subject she was going to speak about. The presentiment made his voice colder and harder as he said, "What is it?" This tone roused a spirit of resistance in Maggie, and she put her request in quite a different form from the one she had predetermined on. She rose from her seat, and looking straight at Tom, said, "I want you to absolve me from my promise about Philip Wakem. Or rather, I promised you not to see him without telling you. I am come to tell you that I wish to see him." "Very well," said Tom, still more coldly. But Maggie had hardly finished speaking in that chill, defiant manner before she repented and felt the dread of alienation from her brother. "Not for myself, dear Tom. Don't be angry. I shouldn't have asked it, only that Philip, you know, is a friend of Lucy's, and she wishes him to come, has invited him to come this evening, and I told her I couldn't see him without telling you. I shall only see him in the presence of other people. There will never be anything secret between us again." Tom looked away from Maggie, knitting his brow more strongly for a little while. Then he turned to her and said slowly and emphatically, "You know what is my feeling on that subject, Maggie. There is no need for my repeating anything I said a year ago. While my father was living, I felt bound to use the utmost power over you to prevent you from disgracing him as well as yourself and all of us. But now I must leave you to your own choice. You wish to be independent. You told me so after my father's death. My opinion is not changed. If you think of Philip Wakem as a lover again, you must give up me." "I don't wish it, dear Tom, at least as things are. I see that it would lead to misery. But I shall soon go away to another situation, and I should like to be friends with him again while I am here. Lucy wishes it." The severity of Tom's face relaxed a little. "I shouldn't mind your seeing him occasionally at my uncle's. I don't want you to make a fuss on the subject. But I have no confidence in you, Maggie. You would be led away to do anything." That was a cruel word. Maggie's lip began to tremble. "Why will you say that, Tom? It is very hard of you. Have I not done and borne everything as well as I could? And I kept my word to you when— My life has not been a happy one any more than yours." She was obliged to be childish. The tears would come. When Maggie was not angry, she was as dependent on kind or cold words as a daisy on the sunshine or the cloud. The need of being loved would always subdue her, as in old days it subdued her in the worm-eaten attic. The brother's goodness came uppermost at this appeal, but it could only show itself in Tom's fashion. He put his hand gently on her arm, and said, in the tone of a kind pedagogue, "Now listen to me, Maggie, and I'll tell you what I mean. You're always in extremes. You have no judgment and self-command, and yet you think you know best, and will not submit to be guided. You know I didn't wish you to take a situation. My Aunt Paulette was willing to give you a good home, and you might have lived respectably amongst your relations until I could have provided a home for you with my mother. And that is what I should like to do. I wished my sister to be a lady, and I always have taken care of you, as my father desired, until you were well married. But your ideas and mine never accord, and you will not give way. Yet you might have sense enough to see that a brother who goes out into the world and mixes with men necessarily knows better what is right and respectable for his sister than she can know herself. You think I am not kind, but my kindness can only be directed by what I believe to be good for you." "Yes, I know, dear Tom," said Maggie, still half sobbing, but trying to control her tears. "I know you would do a great deal for me. I know how you work, and don't spare yourself. I am grateful to you. But indeed you can't quite judge for me. Our natures are very different. You don't know how differently things affect me from what they do you." "Yes, I do know. I know it too well. I know how differently you must feel about all that affects our family and your own dignity as a young woman before you could think of receiving secret addresses from Philip Wakem. If it was not disgusting to me in every other way, I should object to my sister's name being associated for a moment with that of a young man whose father must hate the very thought of us all, and would spurn you. With any one but you, I should think it quite certain that what you witnessed just before my father's death would secure you from ever thinking again of Philip Wakem as a lover. But I don't feel certain of it with you. I never feel certain about anything with you. At one time you take pleasure in a sort of perverse self-denial, and at another you have not resolution to resist a thing that you know to be wrong." There was a terrible cutting truth in Tom's words, that hard rind of truth which is discerned by unimaginative, unsympathetic minds. Maggie always writhed under this judgment of Tom's. She rebelled and was humiliated in the same moment. It seemed as if he held a glass before her to show her her own folly and weakness, as if he were a prophetic voice predicting her future fallings, and yet, all the while, she judged him in return. She said inwardly that he was narrow and unjust, that he was below feeling those mental needs which were often the source of the wrongdoing or absurdity that made her life a planless riddle to him. She did not answer directly. Her heart was too full, and she sat down, leaning her arm on the table. It was no use trying to make Tom feel that she was near to him. He always repelled her. Her feeling under his words was complicated by the allusion to the last scene between her father and Wakem, and at length that painful, solemn memory surmounted the immediate grievance. No, she did not think of such things with frivolous indifference, and Tom must not accuse her of that. She looked up at him with a grave, earnest gaze, and said, "I can't make you think better of me, Tom, by anything I can say, but I am not so shut out from all your feelings as you believe me to be. I see as well as you do that from our position with regard to Philip's father, not on other grounds, it would be unreasonable, it would be wrong for us to entertain the idea of marriage, and I have given up thinking of him as a lover. I am telling you the truth, and you have no right to disbelieve me. I have kept my word to you, and you have never detected me in a falsehood. I should not only not encourage, I should carefully avoid any intercourse with Philip on any other footing than of quiet friendship. You may think that I am unable to keep my resolutions, but at least you ought not to treat me with hard contempt on the ground of faults that I have not committed yet." "Well, Maggie," said Tom, softening under this appeal, "I don't want to overstrain matters. I think, all things considered, it will be best for you to see Philip Wakem if Lucy wishes him to come to the house. I believe what you say, at least you believe it yourself, I know. I can only warn you. I wish to be as good a brother to you as you will let me." There was a little tremor in Tom's voice as he uttered the last words, and Maggie's ready affection came back with as sudden a glow as when they were children, and bit their cake together as a sacrament of conciliation. She rose and laid her hand on Tom's shoulder. "Dear Tom, I know you mean to be good. I know you have had a great deal to bear, and have done a great deal. I should like to be a comfort to you, not to vex you. You don't think I'm altogether naughty, now do you?" Tom smiled at the eager face. His smiles were very pleasant to see when they did come, for the grey eyes could be tender underneath the frown. "No, Maggie. I may turn out better than you expect. I hope you will. And may I come some day and make tea for you, and see this extremely small wife of Bob's again?" "Yes, but trot away now, for I've no more time to spare," said Tom, looking at his watch. "Not to give me a kiss?" Tom bent to kiss her cheek, and then said, "There, be a good girl. I've got a great deal to think of to-day. I'm going to have a long consultation with my Uncle Deane this afternoon." "You'll come to Aunt Glegg's to-morrow? We're all going to dine early, that we may go there to tea. You must come. Lucy told me to say so." "Oh, pooh! I've plenty else to do," said Tom, pulling his bell violently and bringing down the small bell-rope. "I'm frightened I shall run away," said Maggie, making a laughing retreat, while Tom, with masculine philosophy, flung the bell-rope to the farther end of the room, not very far either, a touch of human experience which I flatter myself will come home to the bosoms of not a few substantial or distinguished men, who were once at an early stage of their rise in the world, and were cherishing very large hopes in very small lodgings. End of Book 6, Chapter 4. Recording by Amanda Hindman in Glen, Mississippi. www.livinginbooks.blogspot.com.
Book 6, Chapter 5 of The Mill on the Floss. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ted Nugent. The Mill on the Floss by George Eliot. Book 6, The Great Temptation. Chapter 5, showing that Tom had opened the oyster. "And now we have settled this Newcastle business, Tom," said Mr. Deane, that same afternoon, as they were seated in the private room at the bank together. "There's another matter I want to talk to you about. Since you're likely to have a rather smoky, unpleasant time of it at Newcastle for the next few weeks, you will want a good prospect of some sort to keep up your spirits." Tom waited less nervously than he had done on a former occasion in this apartment, while his uncle took out his snuff-box and gratified each nostril with deliberate impartiality. "You see, Tom," said Mr. Deane at last, throwing himself backward, "the world goes on at a smarter pace now than it did when I was a young fellow. Why, sir, 40 years ago, when I was much such a strapping youngster as you, a man expected to pull between the shafts the best part of his life before he got the whip in his hand. The looms went slowish, and fashion didn't alter quite so fast. I'd a best suit that lasted me 6 years. Everything was on a lower scale, sir. In point of expenditure, I mean. It's this steam, you see, that has made the difference. It drives on every wheel double pace, and the wheel of fortune along with them, as our Mr. Stephen Gass said at the anniversary dinner. He hit this thing off wonderfully, considering he has seen nothing of business. I don't find fault with the change, as some people do. Trade, sir, opens a man's eyes, and if the population is to get thicker upon the ground, as it's doing, the world must use its wits at invention of one sort or other. I know I've done my share as an ordinary man of business. Somebody has said
It's a fine thing to make 2 ears of corn grow where only one grew before. But, sir, it's a fine thing too to further the exchange of commodities and bring the grains of corn to the mouths that are hungry. And that's our line of business, and I consider it as honorable a position as a man can hold to be connected with it. Tom knew that the affair his uncle had to speak of was not urgent. Mr. Deane was too shrewd and practical a man to allow either his reminiscences or his snuff to impede the progress of trade. Indeed, for the last month or two, there had been hints thrown out to Tom which enabled him to guess that he was going to hear some proposition for his own benefit. With the beginning of the last speech, he had stretched out his legs, thrust his hands in his pockets, and prepared himself for some introductory diffusences, tending to show that Mr. Deane had succeeded by his own merit, and that what he had to say to young men in general was that if they didn't succeed too, it was because of their own demerit. He was rather surprised then when his uncle put a direct question to him. "Let me see. It's going on for 7 years now, since you applied to me for a situation, Tom?" "Yes, sir. I'm 23 now," said Tom. "Ah, it's as well not to say that, though, for you pass for a good deal older, and age tells well in business. I remember your coming very well. I remember I saw there was some pluck in you, and that was what made me give you encouragement. And I am happy to say I was right. I'm not often deceived. I was naturally a little shy at pushing my nephew, but I am happy to say you've done me credit, sir. And if I had a son of my own, I shouldn't have been sorry to see him like you." Mr. Deane tapped his box and opened it again, repeating in a tone of some feeling, "Oh no, I shouldn't have been sorry to see him like you." "I'm very glad I've given you satisfaction, sir. I've done my best," said Tom in his proud, independent way. "Yes, Tom, you've given me satisfaction. I don't speak of your conduct as a son, though that weighs with me in my opinion of you. But what I have to do as a partner in our firm is the qualities you have shown as a man of business. Ours is a fine business, a splendid concern, sir, and there's no reason why it shouldn't go on growing. There is the growing capital and growing outlets for it. But there is another thing that wanted for the prosperity of every concern, large or small, and that's men to conduct it, men of right habits. None of your flashy fellows, but such are to be depended on. Now, this is what Mr. Guest and I see clear enough. 3 years ago, we took Gell into the concern. We gave him a share in the oil mill. And why? Why? Because Gell was a fellow whose services were worth a premium. So it will always be so. So it was with me. And though Gell is pretty nearly 10 years older than you, there are other points in your favor." Tom was getting a little nervous as Mr. Deane went on speaking. He was conscious of something he had in mind to say, which might not be agreeable to his uncle, simply because it was a new suggestion rather than an acceptance of the proposition he foresaw. "It stands to reason," Mr. Deane went on, when he had finished his new pinch, That your being my nephew weighs in your favor, but I don't deny that if you'd been no relation of mine at all, your conduct in that affair of Palace Bank would have led Mr. Guest and myself to make some acknowledgment of the service you've been to us, and, backed by your general conduct and business ability, it has made us determine on giving you a share in the business, a share which we shall be glad to increase as the years go on. We think that will be better on all grounds than raising your salary. It will give you more importance and prepare you better for taking some of the anxiety off my shoulders by and by. I'm equal to a good deal of work at present, thank God, but I'm getting older. There's no denying that. I told Mr. Guest I would open the subject to you, and when you come back from this northern business, we can go into particulars. This is a great stride for a young fellow of 23, but I am bound to say you've deserved it.
I'm very grateful for Mr. Guest and you, sir. Of course, I feel the most indebted to you, who first took me into the business, and have taken a good deal of pains with me since. Tom spoke with a slight tremor, and paused after he had said this. Yes, yes, said Mr. Deane. I don't spare pains when I see they won't be of any use. I gave myself some trouble with Gell, else he wouldn't have been what he is. But there's another thing I should like to mention to you, uncle. I've never spoken to you of it before. If you remember, at the time my father's property was sold, there was some thought of your firm buying the mill. I know you thought it would be a very good investment, especially if steam were applied. To be sure. But Wakem outbid us. He'd made up his mind to that. He's rather fond of carrying everything over other people's heads. Perhaps it's of no use my mentioning it at present, Tom went on, but I wish you to know what I have in mind about the mill. I've strong feeling about it. It was my father's dying wish that I should try and get it back again whenever I could. It was in his family for 5 generations. I promised my father, and beside that, I'm attached to the place. I shall never like any other so well. And if it should ever suit your views to buy it for the firm, I should have a better chance of fulfilling my father's wish. I shouldn't have liked to mention the thing to you, only you've been kind enough to say my services have been of some value, and I'd give up a much greater chance in life for the sake of having the mill again. I mean, having it in my own hands and gradually working off the price. Mr. Deane had listened attentively and now looked thoughtful. I see, he said after a while. The thing would be possible if there were any chance of Wakem's parting with the property, but that I don't see. He's put that young Jetsam in the place, and he had his reasons when he bought it. I won't be bound. He's the loose fish, that young Jetsam, said Tom. He's taking to drinking, and they say he's letting the business go down. Luke told me about it, our old miller. He says he shan't stay unless there's an alteration. I was thinking, if things went on that way, Wakem might be more willing to part with the mill. Luke says he's getting very sour about the way things are going on. Well, I will turn it over, Tom. I must inquire into the matter, and go into it with Mr. Guest.
But, you see, it's rather striking out a new branch and putting you to that, instead of keeping you where you are, which was what we'd wanted. I should be able to manage more than the mill when things were once set properly going, sir. I want to have plenty of work. There's nothing else I care about much." There was something rather sad in that speech from a young man of 23, even in Uncle Deane's business-loving years.
"Pooh, pooh! You will be having a wife to care about one of these days, if you get on at this pace in the world. But as to the mill, we mustn't reckon on our chickens too early. However, I promise you to bear it in mind, and when you come back we will talk of it again. I'm going to dinner now. Come and breakfast with us tomorrow morning, and say goodbye to your mother and sister before you start."
End of Book 6, Chapter 5.
Chapter 6 of The Mill on the Floss. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Amanda Hindman. The Mill on the Floss by George Eliot. Book 6. The Great Temptation. Chapter 6. Illustrating the Laws of Attraction. It is evident to you now that Maggie had arrived at a moment in her life which must be considered by all prudent persons as a great opportunity for a young woman. Launched into the higher society of St Oggs with a striking person, which had the advantage of being quite unfamiliar to the majority of beholders, and with such moderate assistance of costume as you have seen foreshadowed in Lucy's anxious colloquy with Aunt Paulette, Maggie was certainly at a new starting point in life. At Lucy's first evening party, young Tory fatigued his facial muscles more than usual, in order that the dark-eyed girl there in the corner might see him in all the additional style conferred by his eyeglass; and several young ladies went home intending to have short sleeves with black lace, and to plait their hair in a broad coronet at the back of their head. That cousin of Miss Deane's looked so very well. In fact, poor Maggie, with all her inward consciousness of a painful past, and her presentiment of a troublous future, was on the way to become an object of some envy, a topic of discussion in the newly established billiard-room, and between fair friends who had no secrets from each other on the subject of trimmings. The Miss Guests, who associated chiefly on terms of condescension with the families of St Oggs, and were the glass of fashion there, took some exception to Maggie's manners. She had a way of not assenting at once to the observations current in good society, and of saying that she didn't know whether those observations were true or not, which gave her an air of gaucherie, and impeded the even flow of conversation. But it is a fact capable of an amiable interpretation, that ladies are not the worse disposed toward a new acquaintance of their own sex because she has points of inferiority; and Maggie was so entirely without those pretty airs of coquetry which have the traditional reputation of driving gentlemen to despair, that she won some feminine pity for being so ineffective in spite of her beauty. She had not had many advantages, poor thing, and it must be admitted there was no pretension about her. Her abruptness and unevenness of manner were plainly the result of her secluded and lowly circumstances. It was only a wonder that there was no tinge of vulgarity about her, considering what the rest of poor Lucy's relations were, an illusion which always made the Miss Guests shudder a little. It was not agreeable to think of any connection by marriage with such people as the Gleggs and the Paulettes, but it was of no use to contradict Stephen when once he had set his mind on anything, and certainly there was no possible objection to Lucy in herself. No one could help liking her. She would naturally desire that the Miss Guests should behave kindly to this cousin of whom she was so fond, and Stephen would make a great fuss if they were deficient in civility. Under these circumstances the invitations to Park House were not wanting, and elsewhere also Miss Deane was too popular and too distinguished a member of society in St Oggs for any attention toward her to be neglected. Thus Maggie was introduced for the first time to the young lady's life, and knew what it was to get up in the morning without any imperative reason for doing one thing more than another. This new sense of leisure and unchecked enjoyment, amidst the soft breathing airs and garden scents of advancing spring, amidst the new abundance of music, and lingering strolls in the sunshine, and the delicious dreaminess of gliding on the river, could hardly be without some intoxicating effect on her, after her years of privation. And even in the first week Maggie began to be less haunted by her sad memories and anticipations. Life was certainly very pleasant just now. It was becoming very pleasant to dress in the evening, and to feel that she was one of the beautiful things of this springtime, and there were admiring eyes always awaiting her now. She was no longer an unheeded person, liable to be shied, from whom attention was continually claimed, and on whom no one felt bound to confer any. It was pleasant, too, when Stephen and Lucy were gone out riding, to sit down at the piano alone, and find that the old fitness between her fingers and the keys remained, and revived, like a sympathetic kinship not to be worn out by separation; to get the tunes she had heard the evening before, and repeat them again and again, until she had found out a way of producing them so as to make them a more pregnant, passionate language to her. The mere concord of octaves was a delight to Maggie, and she would often take up a book of studies rather than any melody, that she might taste more keenly by abstraction the more primitive sensation of intervals. Not that her enjoyment of music was of the kind that indicates a great specific talent; it was rather that her sensibility to the supreme excitement of music was only one form of that passionate sensibility which belonged to her whole nature, and made her faults and virtues all merge in each other, made her affections sometimes an impatient demand, but also prevented her vanity from taking the form of mere feminine coquetry and device, and gave it the poetry of ambition. But you have known Maggie a long while, and need to be told, not her characteristics, but her history, which is a thing hardly to be predicted even from the completest knowledge of characteristics, for the tragedy of our lives is not created entirely from within. Character, says Novalis, in one of his questionable aphorisms, character is destiny, but not the whole of our destiny. Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, was speculative and irresolute, and we have a great tragedy in consequence. But if his father had lived to a good old age, and his uncle had died an early death, we can conceive Hamlet's having married Ophelia and got through life with a reputation of sanity, notwithstanding many soliloquies and some moody sarcasms toward the fair daughter of Polonius, to say nothing of the frankest incivility to his father-in-law. Maggie's destiny, then, is at present hidden, and we must wait for it to reveal itself like the course of an unmapped river. We only know that the river is full and rapid, and that for all rivers there is the same final home. Under the charm of her new pleasures, Maggie herself was ceasing to think, with her eager prefiguring imagination, of her future lot, and her anxiety about her first interview with Philip was losing its predominance. Perhaps unconsciously to herself she was not sorry that the interview had been deferred, for Philip had not come the evening he was expected, and Mr Stephen Guest brought word that he was gone to the coast, probably, he thought, on a sketching expedition, but it was not certain when he would return. It was just like Philip to go off in that way without telling any one. It was not until the 12th day that he returned, to find both Lucy's notes awaiting him. He had left before he knew of Maggie's arrival. Perhaps one had need be 19 again to be quite convinced of the feelings that were crowded for Maggie into those 12 days, of the length to which they were stretched for her by the novelty of her experience in them, and the varying attitudes of her mind. The early days of an acquaintance almost always have this importance for us, and fill up a larger space in our memory than longer subsequent periods which have been less filled with discovery and new impressions. There were not many hours in those 10 days in which Mr Stephen Guest was not seated by Lucy's side, or standing near her at the piano, or accompanying her on some outdoor excursion. His attentions were clearly becoming more assiduous, and that was what every one had expected. Lucy was very happy, all the happier because Stephen's society seemed to have become much more interesting and amusing since Maggie had been there. Playful discussions, sometimes serious ones, were going forward, in which both Stephen and Maggie revealed themselves, to the admiration of the gentle, unobtrusive Lucy, and it more than once crossed her mind what a charming quartet they should have through life when Maggie married Philip. Is it an inexplicable thing that a girl should enjoy her lover's society the more for the presence of a third person, and be without the slightest spasm of jealousy that the third person had the conversation habitually directed to her? Not when that girl is as tranquil-hearted as Lucy, thoroughly possessed with the belief that she knows the state of her companion's affections, and not prone to the feelings which shake such a belief in the absence of positive evidence against it. Besides, it was Lucy by whom Stephen sat, to whom he gave his arm, to whom he appealed as the person sure to agree with him, and every day there was the same tender politeness toward her, the same consciousness of her wants and care to supply them. Was there really the same? It seemed to Lucy that there was more, and it was no wonder that the real significance of the change escaped her. It was a subtle act of conscience in Stephen that even he himself was not aware of. His personal attentions to Maggie were comparatively slight, and there had even sprung up an apparent distance between them that prevented the renewal of that faint resemblance to gallantry into which he had fallen the first day in the boat. If Stephen came in when Lucy was out of the room, if Lucy left them together, they never spoke to each other. Stephen, perhaps, seemed to be examining books or music, and Maggie bent her head assiduously over her work. Each was oppressively conscious of the other's presence, even to the finger ends. Yet each looked and longed for the same thing to happen the next day. Neither of them had begun to reflect on the matter, or silently to ask, to what does all this tend? Maggie only felt that life was revealing something quite new to her, and she was absorbed in the direct, immediate experience, without any energy left for taking account of it and reasoning about it. Stephen wilfully abstained from self-questioning, and would not admit to himself that he felt an influence which was to have any determining effect on his conduct. And when Lucy came into the room again, they were once more unconstrained. Maggie could contradict Stephen and laugh at him, and he could recommend to her consideration the example of that most charming heroine, Miss Sophia Western, who had a great respect for the understandings of men. Maggie could look at Stephen, which, for some reason or other, she always avoided when they were alone, and he could even ask her to play his accompaniment for him, since Lucy's fingers were so busy with that bazaar work, and lecture her on hurrying the tempo, which was certainly Maggie's weak point. One day, it was the day of Philip's return, Lucy had formed a sudden engagement to spend the evening with Mrs Kenn, whose delicate state of health, threatening to become confirmed illness through an attack of bronchitis, obliged her to resign her functions at the coming bazaar into the hands of other ladies, of whom she wished Lucy to be one. The engagement had been formed in Stephen's presence, and he had heard Lucy promise to dine early and call at 6 o'clock for Miss Torry, who brought Mrs Kenn's request. "Here is another of the moral results of this idiotic bazaar," Stephen burst forth, as soon as Miss Torry had left the room, "taking young ladies from the duties of the domestic hearth into scenes of dissipation among urn rugs and embroidered reticules. I should like to know what is the proper function of women if it is not to make reasons for husbands to stay at home, and still stronger reasons for bachelors to go out. If this goes on much longer, the bonds of society will be dissolved." "Well, it will not go on much longer," said Lucy, laughing, "for the bazaar is to take place on Monday week." "Thank heaven!" said Stephen. Can himself said the other day that he didn't like this plan of making vanity do the work of charity; but just as the British public is not reasonable enough to bear direct taxation, so St Oggs has not got force of motive enough to build and endow schools without calling in the force of folly. "Did he say so?" said little Lucy, her hazel eyes opening wide with anxiety. "I never heard him say anything of that kind. I thought he approved of what we were doing." I'm sure he approves you," said Stephen, smiling at her affectionately. "Your conduct in going out to-night looks vicious, I own, but I know there is benevolence at the bottom of it." "Oh, you think too well of me," said Lucy, shaking her head with a pretty blush. And there the subject ended. But it was tacitly understood that Stephen would not come in the evening, and on the strength of that tacit understanding he made his morning visit the longer, not saying good-bye until after 4. Maggie was seated in the drawing-room alone shortly after dinner, with Minnie on her lap, having left her uncle to his wine and his nap, and her mother to the compromise between knitting and nodding, which, when there was no company, she always carried on in the dining-room till tea-time. Maggie was stooping to caress the tiny silken pet, and comforting him for his mistress's absence, when the sound of a footstep on the gravel made her look up, and she saw Mr Stephen Guest walking up the garden, as if he had come straight from the river. It was very unusual to see him so soon after dinner. He often complained that their dinner hour was late at Park House. Nevertheless, there he was, in his black dress. He had evidently been home, and must have come again by the river. Maggie felt her cheeks glowing and her heart beating. It was natural she should be nervous, for she was not accustomed to receive visitors alone. He had seen her look up through the open window, and raised his hat as he walked toward it, to enter that way instead of by the door. He blushed too, and certainly looked as foolish as a young man of some wit and self-possession can be expected to look, as he walked in with a roll of music in his hand, and said, with an air of hesitating improvisation, "You are surprised to see me again, Miss Tulliver. I ought to apologize for coming upon you by surprise, but I wanted to come into the town, and I got our man to row me, so I thought I would bring these things from the maid of Artois for your cousin. I forgot them this morning. Will you give them to her?" "Yes," said Maggie, who had risen confusedly with Minnie in her arms, and now, not quite knowing what else to do, sat down again. Stephen laid down his hat, with the music, which rolled on the floor, and sat down in the chair close by her. He had never done so before, and both he and Maggie were quite aware that it was an entirely new position. "Well, you pampered minion," said Stephen, leaning to pull the long curly ears that drooped over Maggie's arm. It was not a suggestive remark, and as the speaker did not follow it up by further development, it naturally left the conversation at a standstill. It seemed to Stephen like some action in a dream that he was obliged to do, and wonder at himself all the while, to go on stroking Minnie's head. Yet it was very pleasant. He only wished he dared look at Maggie, and that she would look at him. Let him have one long look into those deep, strange eyes of hers, and then he would be satisfied, and quite reasonable after that. He thought it was becoming a sort of monomania with him, to want that long look from Maggie, and he was racking his invention continually to find out some means by which he could have it without its appearing singular and entailing subsequent embarrassment. As for Maggie, she had no distinct thought, only the sense of a presence like that of a closely hovering broad-winged bird in the darkness, for she was unable to look up, and saw nothing but Minnie's black wavy coat. But this must end some time. Perhaps it ended very soon, and only seemed long, as a minute's dream does. Stephen at last sat upright sideways in his chair, leaning one hand and arm over the back, and looking at Maggie. What should he say? "We shall have a splendid sunset, I think. Shan't you go out and see it?" "I don't know," said Maggie. Then, courageously raising her eyes and looking out of the window, "if I'm not playing cribbage with my uncle." A pause, during which Minnie is stroked again, but has sufficient insight not to be grateful for it, to growl rather. "Do you like sitting alone?" A rather arch look came over Maggie's face, and just glancing at Stephen, she said, "Would it be quite civil to say yes?" "It was rather a dangerous question for an intruder to ask," said Stephen, delighted with that glance, and getting determined to stay for another. "But you will have more than half an hour to yourself after I'm gone," he added, taking out his watch. "I know Mr Deane never comes in till 7:30. Another pause, during which Maggie looked steadily out of the window, till by a great effort she moved her head to look down at Minnie's back again, and said, "I wish Lucy had not been obliged to go out. We lose our music." "We shall have a new voice to-morrow night," said Stephen. "Will you tell your cousin that our friend Philip Wakem is come back? I saw him as I went home." Maggie gave a little start. It seemed hardly more than a vibration that passed from head to foot in an instant, but the new images summoned by Philip's name dispersed half the oppressive spell she had been under. She rose from her chair with a sudden resolution, and laying Minnie on his cushion, went to reach Lucy's large work-basket from its corner. Stephen was vexed and disappointed. He thought perhaps Maggie didn't like the name of Wakem to be mentioned to her in that abrupt way, for he now recalled what Lucy had told him of the family quarrel. It was of no use to stay any longer. Maggie was seating herself at the table with her work, and looking chill and proud, and he looked like a simpleton for having come. A gratuitous, entirely superfluous visit of that sort was sure to make a man disagreeable and ridiculous. Of course it was palpable to Maggie's thinking that he had dined hastily in his own room for the sake of setting off again and finding her alone. A boyish state of mind for an accomplished young gentleman of 25, not without legal knowledge, but a reference to history perhaps may make it not incredible. At this moment Maggie's ball of knitting-wool rolled along the ground, and she started up to reach it. Stephen rose too, and picking up the ball, met her with a vexed, complaining look that gave his eyes quite a new expression to Maggie, whose own eyes met them as he presented the ball to her. "Good-bye," said Stephen, in a tone that had the same beseeching discontent as his eyes. He dared not put out his hand; he thrust both hands into his tail-pockets as he spoke. Maggie thought she had perhaps been rude. "Won't you stay?" she said timidly, not looking away, for that would have seemed rude again. "No, thank you," said Stephen, looking still into the half-unwilling, half-fascinated eyes, as a thirsty man looks toward the track of the distant brook. "The boat is waiting for me. You'll tell your cousin?" "Yes." "That I brought the music, I mean?" "Yes." "And that Philip has come back?" "Yes." Maggie did not notice Philip's name this time. "Won't you come out a little way into the garden?" said Stephen, in a still gentler tone. But the next moment he was vexed that she did not say no, for she moved away now toward the open window, and he was obliged to take his hat and walk by her side. But he thought of something to make him amends. "Do take my arm," he said, in a low tone, as if it were a secret. There is something strangely winning to most women in that offer of the firm arm. The help is not wanted physically at that moment, but the sense of help, the presence of strength that is outside them and yet theirs, meets a continual want of the imagination. Either on that ground or some other, Maggie took the arm, and they walked together round the grass-plot and under the drooping green of the laburnums, in the same dim, dreamy state as they had been in a quarter of an hour before, only that Stephen had had the look he longed for, without yet perceiving in himself the symptoms of returning reasonableness, and Maggie had darting thoughts across the dimness. How came he to be there? Why had she come out? Not a word was spoken. If it had been, each would have been less intensely conscious of the other. "Take care of this step," said Stephen at last. "Oh, I will go in now," said Maggie, feeling that the step had come like a rescue. "Good evening." In an instant she had withdrawn her arm, and was running back to the house. She did not reflect that this sudden action would only add to the embarrassing recollections of the last half-hour. She had no thought left for that. She only threw herself into the low arm-chair and burst into tears. "Oh, Philip, Philip, I wish we were together again, so quietly, in the red deeps." Stephen looked after her a moment, then went on to the boat, and was soon landed at the wharf. He spent the evening in the billiard-room, smoking one cigar after another, and losing lives at pool, but he would not leave off. He was determined not to think, not to admit any more distinct remembrance than was urged upon him by the perpetual presence of Maggie. He was looking at her, and she was on his arm. But there came the necessity of walking home in the cool starlight, and with it the necessity of cursing his own folly, and bitterly determining that he would never trust himself alone with Maggie again. It was all madness. He was in love, thoroughly attached to Lucy, and engaged as strongly as an honourable man need be. He wished he had never seen this Maggie Tulliver. To be thrown into a fever by her in this way! She would make a sweet, strange, troublesome, adorable wife to some man or other, but he would never have chosen her himself. Did she feel as he did? He hoped she did not. He ought not to have gone. He would master himself in future. He would make himself disagreeable to her, quarrel with her perhaps. Quarrel with her! Was it possible to quarrel with a creature who had such eyes, defying and deprecating, contradicting and clinging, imperious and beseeching, full of delicious opposites? To see such a creature subdued by love for one would be a lot worth having, to another man. There was a muttered exclamation which ended this inward soliloquy, as Stephen threw away the end of his last cigar, and thrusting his hands into his pockets, stalked along at a quieter pace through the shrubbery. It was not of a benedictory kind. End of Book 6, Chapter 6. Recording by Amanda Hindman, England, Mississippi. www.livinginbooks.blogspot.com